Thousands of listeners across the nation rely on Garden Variety to grow everything better. And we rely on listener support to sustain our little garden of knowledge. You can help Garden Variety flourish with a gift today. Donate now at ipr.org/donate.
This is Garden Variety, a horticulture podcast from Iowa Public Radio and Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. I'm Charity Nebbe. A healthy plant needs a healthy root system, and in some cases, it's better if that root system comes from a different plant. We call these rootstocks, and today we'll find out how rootstocks shape a tree or shrub that is grafted onto it, and why the practice of using rootstock is so common. Randall Voss is our guide today, Iowa State University Extension horticulture specialist. Hello, Randall.
Good morning.
So this is not a very glamorous topic. But tell me what a rootstock is. They're doing the hard work.
Yeah, they're doing the hard work. So rootstocks are basically, when you graft a plant, that's what we call the scion, which is the named variety that people are usually focusing on when they buy something. And the rootstock is the part that there's a little bit of the stem that's above ground, but it comprises the entire root system.
Okay, and where does it come from?
Yeah, usually nurseries will just buy them or propagate them themselves. They've basically found roots that do the job that we want them to do. They're maybe more vigorous than the name varieties, or will change the size of the scion that it's grafted to. Or they're more disease resistant or tolerant of various soil conditions.
Does using rootstock also give people the opportunity to propagate a really desired variety of something more quickly?
Yeah, so a lot of our plant varieties, not all of them root very well from cuttings. And for most woody plants, for example, we can't grow them from seed, like the common name varieties of fruits or, shade trees or whatever. They just don't root very well in some cases, or the roots are weak. And so a way you can very quickly propagate them is, we have some seedlings or cuttings that are already rooted, and we just take one bud from these name varieties and very quickly we can reproduce them.
Does the rootstock have to match the plant? Like, does it have to, if we're talking about an apple tree, does it have to be an apple tree rootstock?
Yeah, that's where it gets a little complicated. Things are never simple, but they have to be somewhat related. And so, you're not going to graft an apple tree onto a peach tree or something like that. So they have to be somewhat related. Don't always have to be the same species. So they have to be somewhat closely related. And even within a species, for example, for some reason, they're incompatible. So it's a little bit of trial and error, actually. Before a company might actually sell grafted plants, generally they'll trial them for a while, and because sometimes a couple years after grafting, they'll become incompatible, and you may not know it right away. But usually they're closely related. It doesn't always have to be the same species, though.
So it gives a plant a strong, healthy root system. It gives you the opportunity to propagate more efficiently, more quickly. Does the rootstock also shape the final product, shape the tree or the shrub?
Yeah, so I guess one thing I'd like to add is they're not always vigorous roots. Actually, if we're trying to get dwarf apple trees, the roots are probably a lot less vigorous. So sometimes rootstocks, our goal is to not have a vigorous plant. But in the case of ornamental plants, like some people call them lollipop trees, or they call them lilac standards or weeping cherries and the like, they'll have a very upright growing tree or rootstock or inner stem, whatever. And then they'll put the weeping part on top to get this kind of, ornamental type thing that a lot of people call a lollipop tree.
So we can use rootstocks for a whole lot of different things. What are the cons to getting a tree that has been grafted like this?
Yeah, the one of the cons is a lot of times in the trade, you don't even know what it's grafted onto, and so That's usually not a huge problem, but I always like to know what the rootstock is before I buy something. But I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to that. Um, a couple issues are crown gall, and crown gall is a bacterium that forms galls, and it's in the environment. It attacks a lot of different species of plants, but grafted plants tend to be a little more prone to crown gall for various reasons. So that's a negative. Another negative is, if a plant basically dies to the ground, let's say it's something marginally hardy, or a bunny girdles it, to the ground or something like that, that rootstock popping out, it's not going to be what you want, right? You really have to just replant if you've had a grafted plant die to the ground or something girdled it. So if you need to completely retrain, you basically have to start over.
And of course, that also means that if something surprising happens to, let's say, your fruit tree, you have to make sure that you know what's growing, right?
Yeah, and usually, especially in apples and peaches and crab apples and a lot of the ornamentals, the rootstock leaf might be a different shape or color than the named variety or the scion. So it's actually usually pretty easy to tell, if you know what you're looking for, that there'll be a different leaf shape or slightly different leaf color.
Now, almost all fruit trees that we buy are grafted.
Yeah, the vast majority of fruit trees are, just because of, if you think of, if you buy like the wild, or people call it the Iowa white peach, that's started from seed quite often. So that's not always grafted, but basically every other fruit tree we buy are grafted, just because, yeah, I always think fruits are like the largest freak of nature in horticulture, right? Like, it's this huge ball of sugar that in the wild, you wouldn't find that. And so a lot of our fruit tree varieties just don't have ideal root systems. And, I don't like picking apples 30 feet high in the air either. And so, having these dwarfing rootstocks really make these plants fit into our yards better and make it easier to grow from like a labor perspective.
So you can basically assume that your fruit trees are grafted. How do you tell if other plants that you buy have been grafted?
If they're young, usually there'll be a little bulge, kind of towards the base, maybe about 6 inches or so from the soil line, give or take. Um, if they've been budded, which is a type of grafting, sometimes there'll be a little kind of crook in the stem where the bud took, and then they cut off the rootstock. A lot of times there's like a subtle change in the bark texture too, where the rootstock might be slightly different in caliper, so thickness of of the trunk, but also just a bark texture. But usually there's kind of a swelling, where it's been grafted.
All right, so you can kind of see the union. Other than fruit trees, what are some of the other things that we might purchase to plant in our yard that would be commonly grafted?
Yeah, some rose bushes are grafted. I don't know, a list of which ones are always grafted and which ones aren't, but quite often roses are grafted. A lot of shade trees are grafted of the name varieties. Again, not all, but a lot of the quote big named shade trees are grafted. Um, like I mentioned, these kind of ornamental weeping type plants, a lot of them are grafted, to get that straight stem and the weeping form on top. And if you buy a Japanese maples, they're marginally hardy here to begin with, but those are all grafted as well.
When you plant a grafted tree, is there anything you need to keep in mind to keep that tree healthy?
Yeah, so a couple things, and I'm guilty of this myself. You don't want suckers to grow from below the graft union. Those suckers are going to be from the rootstock, and we don't want those to take over, because they're not the desirable traits that we want. So we definitely want to not allow suckers to grow from below the graft union from that rootstock. The other thing is just planting too deep. And I know a lot of the folks in the landscape trade, we struggle when we see a lot of plants are planted too deep, or trees in people's yards. That's especially a problem with grafted plants, because in the case of dwarfing plants, like I'll just use apples as the example, if that scion roots into the ground because the rootstock was put below ground, it will grow itself and it will become a crazy tall tree. So you want to keep that scion not in the ground, because we want the rootstock to be the sole source of those roots.
Okay, so that's an important issue. And do they have, other than possibly breaking at that grafted point, are there other weaknesses that might put them at risk?
Yeah, depending on some rootstock sign combinations add a little brittleness to the trees. So that's usually in fruit trees, shade trees. I'm not aware of that being an issue. If we are doing dwarfing rootstocks, for example, really those plants need more care. If a person thinks of a backyard apple tree, they maybe want it to be 10 feet tall or something like that. The key thing with that is to get those small trees, that root system is not super robust. And so in the case of fully dwarf apple trees, they need to be supported. So we trellis them in the commercial world, and they probably need more water than your standard vigorous apple tree. So in the case of dwarfing plants or dwarfing rootstocks, they need a little bit more care and support.
Okay, so take extra care. Other than, I guess, you trellis them in the commercial business. I mean, do you recommend that to homeowners, that they try to actually have physical support for the trees?
Yeah, if I were a homeowner, I would not get a fully dwarfing apple tree. I would get like a semi-dwarf that gets maybe 15, 20 feet tall, because it's tough to support apple trees in the backyard. I mean, you can put a post next to it and all that kind of stuff, but in the case of a backyard, fruit tree, you might just choose like a semi-dwarf apple tree instead. Peaches and those kind, those are standard rootstocks that don't need to be supported.
All young trees are at risk from deer and rabbits. Any special concerns for grafted trees?
Yeah, some people will put like a fine mesh around the graft union, so that, especially in the wintertime, rabbits or voles or whatever don't attack that graft union. So once the trees get a little more barky and rough bark, they might remove them, but oftentimes they'll put some mesh around there just to give it a little protection in case the rabbits are having a rough year and are looking for an easy meal.
Randall Voss, Iowa State University Extension horticulture specialist. For more gardening information and tips, please subscribe to our garden variety newsletter. Find out more at iowapublicradio.org/garden. I'm Charity Nebbe. Garden Variety is a production of Iowa Public Radio and Iowa State University Extension. It's produced by me, Erin Stile, Caitlin Troutman, and the Iowa Public Radio talk show team. For more garden goodness, please subscribe to our Garden Variety newsletter. Just go to iowapublicradio.org/garden. I'm Charity Nebbe. See you next time.